All right, all. Thank you so much for joining us for our May program for the Structural Engineers Association of San Diego. Again, it's a bit of a unique one this month. Um, Let me ask Tony just real quick if you wouldn't mind relinquishing your screen so that I end up kind of popping up, I think, on video. That'd be great. And I think you can just hit stop sharing for the moment, and then we'll come back to you here in just a minute. Excellent.
Really.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us. Really appreciate you guys being attentive, and we've actually had really fantastic attendance for some of our remote seminars. I hope everybody enjoys the nice background that I pulled together for today. Got an upgrade in my office here, which is nice. So wanted to kick things off by recognizing that today is actually our fellows lunch. I know it's a unique situation for our fellows lunch, but usually we would kind of have all of our fellows stand up and be recognized. I want to make sure that you understand that we understand that this organization was kind of built by a lot of our predecessors, and we've inherited a fantastic organization from those of you who've put in a lot of effort over the years. So much appreciated for all the time and effort over the years. I would love to hear how many fellows there are here, but might not be the most organized thing to do with upwards of 50 people on the call. So I will virtually recognize you guys and give you a quick round of applause. Thank you for joining us. Very excited about the program that we have to share today. Before we get to it, we have a couple of announcements. One announcement is that we have our Excellence in Structural Engineering Awards deadline that's coming up this week. There was an extension provided given the unique COVID circumstances last month. This Friday is the final deadline for our Excellence in Engineering Awards submissions. As a reminder, we're really counting on everybody to step up for San Diego. We had probably fewer submissions last year than we would normally see, so would really love to see a lot of submissions coming out and recognizing the fantastic work that the San Diego community does. Next announcement is that we have a post-disaster safety assessment evaluator training workshop scheduled for July 27th. Please keep an eye out for updates on that as it comes out. And then the last being that we have our next meeting in June. That's June 16th. And we are evaluating exactly what that program is going to look like. Traditionally, that would be our Excellence in Engineering Awards dinner, and it was going to be a pretty amazing gala this year. So I hate to see that one slip, but we are going to be finding a great program to make sure that we're staying on our monthly rhythm and also recognizing our Excellence in Engineering Awards submissions and likely winners. With that, I want to recognize our two speakers for today, Tony Court and Peter Maloney, who are going to be sharing first on the San Diego earthquake scenario is going to be Tony's presentation, and then Peter's going to also be providing some context for the existing building survey in San Diego that helped inform some of that effort that our existing buildings committee has been working on. In the spirit of this being our fellows lunch, Tony Court happens to be one of our honored fellows. And so we've asked Jim Stenger to give a short introduction for Tony before we kick off the presentation. Jim, if you wouldn't mind sharing a couple thoughts.
Yeah, hi everybody, Jim Stenger here. First off, I just want to recognize Tony for all of the work he's done. He's a SEAOC fellow, and he served both SEAOC and many other related organizations really for going on 40 years now, if not more. His work is largely centered around preservation and rehabilitation of existing structures, as well as sustainable design, even before sustainable design was really a thing. and he's always had an emphasis of using performance-based seismic engineering to achieve those goals. Serving SEAOSD, he's been a past board member and president, chair of the Sustainable Design Committee. He's also been involved at the state level with SEAOC, Existing Buildings Committee, Performance-Based Seismic Engineering Ad Hoc Committee, and he was part of the Vision 2000 project, which is really one of the early performance-based seismic design guidelines. And he's been involved several other organizations as well, notably with ATC, serving on a couple of committees there, and he's currently a board member of ATC. He's done numerous post-earthquake evaluations, L'Aquila, Italy in 2009, and Christchurch, New Zealand amongst those. Serving with SEAOC, I believe, on the latter one as part of their reconnaissance to that earthquake. And just personally, I've worked with Tony for close to 20 years. Started when I was just out of school, and he really served as a teacher and a mentor to me. And I know he probably has to several others as well, and those he's been involved with. And so I'd just like to reach out and let him know how much I appreciate that, and appreciate all the work he's done for the profession. And
absolutely, thank you, Jim.
Yep.
So we're going to try something here. I'm going to let everybody unmute themselves all at once, and we're going to do a virtual round of applause. So on the count of 3, if you guys could be unmuting yourself, I'd love to have a round of applause for Tony and for that introduction. So everybody find the microphone on your Teams app, unmute yourself. All right.
Hello.
All right. Thank you all, and thank you for that introduction, Jim. Our second speaker is also Peter Maloney today, who's an SE with Degenkolb Engineers with 9 years of experience in both new building design and existing building retrofit and rehab. He received his undergraduate engineering degree from Cal Poly San Luis Obispo before moving to San Diego to complete his master's at UCSD. Peter is currently serving as the Existing Buildings Committee Chair for SEAOSD, where he's leading the efforts for the San Diego Vulnerable Building Inventory. Very much happy to have each of you guys here today, guys. Tony, why don't I go ahead and let you share your screen, and we'll get underway with our presentation. As you're doing that, wanted to mention to the group that the way that we're going to monitor things and have questions for the day is via our chat session. So as you have questions, please feel free to click on the meeting chat and enter those. We're going to take a pause at the end of Tony's presentation and then a pause at the end of Peter's presentation to answer a few questions, and I'll be moderating those as they come in. So that'll be the way that we ask and answer questions for the day. With that, Tony, please take it away. And Tony, be sure to unmute yourself.
How's that?
That's much better.
Good, good. All right. Well, first, thank you, and thanks to Jim for the kind intro. With that list of activities he mentioned, I wonder if I ever did any work. But I think so. Glad to see so many people interested. We've been working on this San Diego earthquake scenario for 5 years. We started out as the San Diego Tijuana scenario, but we finished up as the San Diego because we were lagging behind on the Tijuana side. That may happen in the next couple of years. So with that, I'll get going. Let's see if I can get rid of an image. The report after the 5-year effort was put out a couple of months ago. the final pull together was by Oakland, the Oakland office, and there are a few edits I would yet like to make, but we'll see if that happens. But it's a good report available on the EER website, which I'll give at the end of this talk. Let me acknowledge some of the participants. EERI San Diego organized it. SEAOSD played a major role. And special thanks to Matt Martinez, Peter Maloney, the existing buildings committee, and the College of Fellows, who all contributed, as well as these other organizations listed. And some of our key steering committee members are listed at the bottom. And I'll pause for a moment to say that I'm using the Nigel Priestley approach to slideshow, which is not 2 minutes per slide, but 2 slides per minute. So hold on to your seats and we'll run through 70 slides. The outline of the talk. First, I want to talk about the geohazards mostly associated with the Rose Canyon Fault. Then the impacts of those hazards on buildings and the potential impacts on infrastructure, and then some mitigation opportunities, which is a light at the end of the tunnel. The scenario earthquake, first of all, is supposed to be a realistic quake. This is one that's occurred 10 to 15 times over the last 10,000 years. It's on the Rose Canyon. It's about a 6.9 magnitude with, importantly, 6.5 feet of horizontal fault, surface fault rupture, widespread liquefaction, and high PGAs. And that is the trace we're looking at. Of those key hazards, surface fault rupture was mapped, and we had lots of input from the geologists to come up with this. We've basically got 6.5 feet of fault rupture slip from La Jolla through downtown, and then it splinters out and peters out as it moves towards the border. And 2 of the key areas of interest to me were the San Diego International Airport, where you see we've got several strands slipping with about the full 2 meters of slip there, and then it gets down to Coronado Bay Bridge, where we've got several faults slipping under the bridge and through the approach roads. We worked with USGS to develop the shake map, and you've got pretty intense shaking, 7, 8, 9 throughout the highly populated coastal area, with 9 intensity shaking in downtown area. Liquefaction is the third major hazard, and this is a map of the liquefaction susceptibility. The actual liquefaction is expected to occur more around the bay in that airport zone, Mission Valley, Mission Bay, but not Coronado. I mean, not El Cajon, because that's too far. The accelerations are less there. So it's, in summary, we're looking at 6.5 feet of lateral slip, magnitude 9 shaking, or intensity 9 shaking, and a 0.55 G acceleration downtown. Liquefaction won't be as dramatic as Japan, but it's still 4 to 6 feet of horizontal movement expected and 12 to 20 inches of vertical movement, up to those numbers. And a key problem with San Diego and this fault is that the people live where the fault shaking is most intense. So you can see we've got, this is a pager prediction from USGS, but it shows 2.25 million people living within the high intensity shaking areas 7, 8, 9. To do the assessment, we used Hazus, standard FEMA generated loss estimation program for regional studies. And we got specific data from the tax assessor to populate the inventory of buildings, came out to 700,000 buildings and $380 billion worth of valuation. Then the Hazus estimates with this earthquake that I described, Hazus predicted 120,000 buildings being moderately to severely damaged, 200,000 plus safety inspections required, 8,000 buildings lost, 36,000, and I think many more households displaced, because Hazus does not account for service disruptions at the coast, and I'll get into that in detail later. Thousands of businesses uninterrupted and $38 billion in losses. Again, I think that's light considering that they don't account for direct fault rupture or full effects of liquefaction. All right, so then looking at how the different building types and occupancies are affected. These numbers don't all add up to 100%, but they represent the percent of that building type that's damaged severely or extensively. And so government and commercial buildings, on the order of 14, 15% damaged. When it gets down to single family residence, it's a much smaller percentage, but there are many more of them. So a significant number of single families gets extensively damaged. And one way to think about what is San Diego's vulnerability to earthquakes, what are in the buildings, is to look at the history of seismic design in San Diego. And pre-1939, there were no seismic design requirements. Then from 39 through the 60s, there were pretty limited standards. Those improved through the 70s, but it was really not until 94 with the change to Zone 4 and with the implementation of new ductility design details that we got to good or better seismic design. So basically anything pre-94 is significantly or designed to significantly lower standards than apply today. And this is another illustration of that with those bands of years and the approximate capacity that was required by the codes. And this giving some consideration to both forces and ductility. So I'm showing that buildings pre-94 are designed for somewhere between 20 and 60% of current required capacity. Post 94, it steps up into a reasonable level of design. And if we look at the age of buildings by comparison, this shows that residential buildings are grouped, not more than 70% of the residential buildings are pre-1994. For commercial buildings, it might be similar. I suspect we don't have those numbers exactly, but I suspect a slightly smaller percentage are that old because commercial buildings renew more frequently than residences. So probably less than 70% of the commercial buildings are of that age. But always of key concern in the earthquake are the vulnerable buildings, and this is a topic that Peter will talk about later. And those include notably the non-ductile concrete frame, soft story, tilt-up, unreinforced masonry, also the older steel moment frames, and selected other buildings. And it is an example of their vulnerability. This map is a plot from Hazus showing the red zone is 80% probability of extensive or moderate to severe damage to the buildings of this type, which are older concrete frame, and two notable ones, the Museum of Art, Museum of Man, dead center in the red zone. And one of the ironies of historic preservation is they sort of steer you around doing a retrofit that would be intrusive, but then all the historic buildings are close to the fault, so they're at risk. The city buildings are also at risk. The city plaza buildings date from the 1960s and 70s, the county administration from the late 30s, and these all have some vulnerabilities. The city is moving out of some of them, but they're all moving into some old steel buildings that aren't so good either. This is just a glance view to give you an impression of the number of government facilities located in the high intensity shaking area, the pink band along the coast. And you can see the majority of significant buildings, government buildings, are in that zone. Looking at essential facilities, and these are all things that we looked at within Hazus, the schools, hospitals, police stations, and fire stations are key essential facilities needed post-earthquake. Schools are generally well designed, perform well, no fatalities since the Field Act was enacted in 1933. However, there are some groups of school buildings that don't do as well. We've got several campuses around Mission Bay and Coronado in liquefiable soils. We also have this 50 to 100 AB 300 buildings. AB 300 in the early 2000s looked at the entire inventory of schools and identified buildings that were potentially vulnerable. They were usually non-wood frame construction, heavier buildings, and these still need to be addressed, evaluated, and retrofitted. Hospitals, new ones designed perform pretty well, though Ridgecrest showed that the non-structural systems still get beaten up, and so you can lose a lot of service. Of the older buildings, San Diego, still 50% of the campuses in San Diego use SPC2 buildings, which are supposed to be out of service by 2030. So those are a critical issue, and things are not moving very fast. to getting those fixed. They're lobbying efforts to kill the bill. Police stations are well distributed, usually well designed, but we have several problematic buildings. The headquarters downtown straddles 3 active faults, and then there are 2 headquarter buildings in Mission Valley that are in the liquefaction and fault zone. Hospital or fire stations, again, they're well distributed and well designed generally, but we've got a lack of redundancy, a susceptibility downtown, vulnerability downtown due to lack of service and high intensity shaking, et cetera. So again, looking at a snapshot, you can see in this plot that there's a high concentration, probably the majority of school buildings are in the high intensity shaking area and near the fault. Hospitals, the yellow dots represent these SPC2 buildings, lots of them in Hillcrest and others scattered around the county that need to be replaced by 2030 or should be by that date. Healthcare facilities, again, a snapshot shows high concentration within the high intensity shaking. You'd expect a lot of non-structural damage, if not structural damage, in those buildings. Switching to infrastructure, the ASCE did a survey of all the infrastructure in California on the right here, right half the slide, and came up with a GPA of C-. San Diego, I think, is at best a D+ for various reasons, so I'll get into. Looking at infrastructure and reminding you of the key hazards. The fault rupture runs through the key area of town. High intensity shaking and liquefaction are all occurring where the people are, the businesses are, the infrastructure is. So water first. This is just another quick view to show that we have a lot of key water lines running through the pink zone, a lot of liquefaction potential, a lot of problem potential. The inset on the right, all the little red dots are where water lines cross faults. But breaking that down into a simple analysis and what does it mean, the water to San Diego comes down predominantly from the aqueducts from the north. We then store a lot of it in reservoirs, and then we pump it west with the center arrow there towards the coast. What happens when the fault ruptures 6 feet and you get liquefaction? You probably lose all water service to the coastal regions in green there. Looking at the wastewater systems, same thing. You see a concentration of heavy pipelines straddling the fault in the liquefaction zones, and breaking that down as to how does the wastewater system work. These 3 colored lines, blue, green, and yellow, are the big interceptors, 6 to 10 feet in diameter, that collect all the wastewater and take it to Point Loma. All 3 of them cross the fault. The yellow one is 90 feet below ground when it crosses the fault, hard to fix, and they all are expected to be ruptured, so we have problems with the wastewater. In the green zone, with no water service, you have no sewer, you can't flush the toilet. And then in the yellow zone, all of the wastewater gets interrupted before it gets to Point Loma, and it flows into the bays and the rivers. So not a good situation. This is an example of what does an interceptor look like, and this is Matt Martinez inspecting 90 feet under downtown, and the findings were not good. This was some years back. They've been continuously repairing, and they are in the late stages of lengthwise repair moving towards the airport, but I think they probably have to start over by the time they get to the end. So main interceptor needs to be replaced, and why not replace it in a less vulnerable location? Gas and petroleum lines. Again, you can see the blue lines crossing the fault in the liquefaction zones, potentially at risk. Looking at Coronado, all of the major utilities to Coronado cross the bay between Seaport Village and the ferry landing. The faults zigzag through there. I represented approximately 1 here, but what we're expecting is that the faults will rupture a number of these utilities below the bay and the rest of them above ground on Seaport Village or Coronado side, making Coronado an island again. Roads and bridges, again, you can see the alignment of the fault with Interstate 5 and how it intersects a number of the other key highways. One of the key intersections is 5 and 8, and you can see the liquefaction zone crosshatched and the fault ruptures in red, cutting Interstate 8 and the interchange with 5. So it'll cause major disruption to traffic flow in this central zone of town. But one thing to note there is the blue triangle I'll get to later is the Pure Water San Diego facility being built in the midst of the hazard zone. This is a look at Coronado and approximate location of the faults of the Coronado Bay Bridge. We would expect widespread liquefaction in the golf course area, disrupting the approach road on the Coronado side, plus several feet of movement in these traces that go under the bridge. The bridge, of course, has been retrofitted and to accommodate similar sorts of movements, but not to function after such movements. So we would expect that bridge would be out of commission for inspection, repair, and possible replacement. Looking at the light rail and rail systems, they unfortunately follow the fault trace closely and would likely be disrupted in numerous locations. San Diego Airport, located in the bad zone, in the middle of all in liquefaction zone and with significant fault rupture and ground accelerations occurring. A closer look shows the traces of the faults. We're expecting about 6 feet of slip through the runway at the east end, a smaller slip further up the runway, and then of course widespread liquefaction, and those fault ruptures would disrupt not only the runway but all the incoming utilities, including the fuel lines. Looking at the port, the port utilizes the old artificial lands. Their territory was the tidelands from the old days, so it's all poor soil. This is an example along the Embarcadero. The red line is the edge of the solid ground versus fill, and all of the Embarcadero is fill zone. And this is a picture from courtesy of Matt Martinez, the Embarcadero on the left with the backfill in progress with pumped artificial soil fills. And then the result is the figure on the right. You can see the extent of the fill. And then the port facilities mostly date from the early 20th century. Many have been partially repaired or upgraded since that time, but none of them are really, or virtually none, next to none, are up to date. Two of the key ones are the B Street Pier at the top and the Navy Pier, a couple piers down from there, and they're both mole structures which were not designed for liquefaction. And the mole structure, you can see the soil under the center of the mole structure would be expected to settle and push outward through the revetment to push the wharfs, marginal wharfs, out with it, and you'd have a non-functional system in need of extensive repair. So in summary, on the port, you've got a lot of older structures around the bay. We expect extensive liquefaction damage to those structures. We also expect extensive liquefaction damage to the lifeline utilities and access roads, and then a long, slow recovery process during any waterfront work upgrade through approved by the Corps of Engineers takes a while. Port of San Francisco recently funded a huge project to upgrade their entire wharf, and we would suggest that San Diego would do well to upgrade their waterfront prior to an earthquake. The Navy also, as you know, is located all around the bay in these highly liquefiable zones and fault rupture zones. Another image of the Navy relative to the military relative to the high hazard zones, liquefaction zones, and high shaking zones. So for the Navy, they have a lot of older buildings and older waterfront structures, a lot of new ones too, and upgraded ones. So, you know, certainly credit to where they've upgraded, but there are still a good number of older facilities. And net effect, we would expect some widespread damage to their older waterfront structures, buildings, utilities, and access roads. And they depend entirely on civilian utilities. Here there are movements towards getting some of their own self-sustaining utilities, but currently they're basically dependent upon civilian, and we expect the civilian utilities to be badly damaged. Looking at the ports of entry, there's several of them, and many of them are undergoing upgrades, and the ones on solid ground probably will perform pretty well. The one at San Ysidro, which handles the great bulk of the traffic, daily traffic, is also a new facility, but it's in the midst of a liquefaction zone, and it's not clear that the utilities will survive the event. And then the Mexican side is in question. Everything on the left half of the picture is white here. That's where the San Diego River or Tijuana River Valley goes through, and where the approach roads used to be after the liquefaction. So I think it's highly problematic that you would get the old roads, old bridges on the Tijuana side to continue to function post-earthquake. So in summary on the key impacts, and don't hope for the end yet because we got some more summaries to do, but key impacts, $40 to $60 billion in losses, and Hazus was down in the 40 range, but there are various things they didn't account for, so I think the losses would be greater than that estimate. There will be widespread loss of water, wastewater, and other utilities to the coastal zones, which could potentially lead to mass evacuations. We'd also expect heavy damage to the highly vulnerable seismic older buildings, and we're expecting in general 120,000 buildings moderately damaged or greater, and more than 200,000 safety inspections, with extended disruption to the downtown area, to the government, and to the economy. So as I've given this a few times, and they say, well, what now? That's gloom and doom. So that was the bad news. Now we can move to the good news, the better news, and that is that there are many opportunities to improve things, and with the geologic time clicking towards the next earthquake, we have some time to do some things, but we must start. So the problem is that San Diego was not designed for the Rose Canyon fault zone, at least not for its full impacts. And the solution is that we can begin resiliency planning and mitigation actions now with the Rose Canyon fault zone in mind. We can retrofit our vulnerable buildings, as Peter will talk about, and the government buildings and the essential facilities, and we can modernize the infrastructure systems. And SEAOSD has some opportunities. I think we should be aware of this seismic scenario study, and we should make our clients aware of it, and make them aware of the threat that the Rose Canyon fault zone presents. So I'm sure all of you have talked with owners about their existing building, and they say, we've been here 40 years, we haven't had an earthquake, what's the issue? But there is a real issue, and the report demonstrates that. Inventory and retrofit older buildings, and that's an initiative that we started and Peter has carried a long way, and we'll talk about. And I'm proposing we could have developed shovel-ready retrofit ordinances, which we can easily base on what was done in LA and San Francisco areas, and we could be ready to present those ordinances in the interim or post the next major California earthquake when there's a receptiveness to those ordinances. And we can maintain contact with our city council and board of supervisors to keep them aware of the Rose Canyon fault hazards and of our potential retrofit ordinances. And then we can support and promote the infrastructure renewal projects, which is the next topic I'll talk about. Those projects include the water systems, of course, and the wastewater systems. And there are some interesting initiatives already underway, and there's some additional things that we can do. Because without doing these things, we're expecting the coastal zones to be without key services for 2 to 3 months post-earthquake. So one of the first big projects that's already been accomplished is the emergency water storage project that the water district put together. And the goal of that was to create 6 months plus worth of storage of water locally, so that if the aqueducts from the north get cut off or the supply is otherwise disrupted, we've got 6 months. So that was a good first step. That takes care of, most of those facilities are East County. And that takes care of the arrow on the right. So our water supply is good, but getting the water to the coast has not been resolved yet. One potential way to address that is shown in this example. This was done in Hayward for the Hayward fault, where they built a oversized culvert essentially across the fault zone, a 1/4 mile long or more, and then put a flexible pipe within it. And we could do similar things to get across the Rose Canyon. The wastewater systems present a trickier problem. How do you fix those big interceptors? And I think if you can build around them so they're no longer critical is the one way to go. And San Diego has already started the Pure Water program where they intercept the water before it crosses the fault generally and pump it back east, treat it, and drink it. So they are by 2035, they will be intercepting and treating 35% of San Diego's wastewater. That could be ramped up towards twice that, 70–80%. And then you've got much less dependence on water getting to Point Loma. For first phase of this Pure Water is about to get underway, and right at the bottom of in Mission Valley, they're going to build a pumping station, as shown in the little inset left, that will pump water back up to be treated. The problem is that it's right in the fault. The two strands of the fault cut it isolated from the rest of the community, rupture the pipes that'll go in and out of it. So maybe they can fix, maybe they can move it, who knows, but it's a good program that's getting underway. So finally, we have the report presents 11 recommendations. I'm not going to go through all those. We've talked about some, and Peter will talk more about inventorying the vulnerable buildings. But you can go to the EER website and pull down up the full report and see a little more elaboration on these recommendations. And so then conceptually, this is what we're doing hoping to do with the scenario. We're trying to show what the hazards are and what we can do to mitigate the risks before the earthquake occurs. So what we want to do, this plot is functionality of systems, etc., on the vertical axis, time on the horizontal. The blue line might be where we are now, where we have an aging infrastructure system. The earthquake occurs, we lose 60–70% of the capacity, and we have a long, slow rebuild. And the proposal is to do improvements prior to the earthquake, will greatly lessen the adverse effects of the earthquake, and then greatly shorten the recovery time. So then we're back to a resilient community. We will have addressed the key risks posed by the Rose Canyon Fault. So that's it. Thank you. If you have any questions, we've got a few minutes to answer them.
Thank you, Tony. Much appreciated. As a reminder, we are collecting questions in the meeting chat. And if you would like to access the meeting chat, if you hover over the bar, your control bar on Teams, there is a little blurb that looks like a cartoon, like dialog box that shows the conversation. If you click on that, it'll show you a bar over to the right-hand side of your screen to show you the conversation, and feel free to type in a message there. We have not received any questions just yet, so Tony, I might just ask if we want to pause for just a minute and see if anybody wants to get a question typed in into our chat.
All right. What are you seeing on your screen currently? I'm seeing a blue box.
Well, we were just seeing your screen, Tony, but it just switched to a nice blue screen, which is very calming.
Let me see if I can get that. All right,
Peter, while we're just waiting to see if anybody else wants to ask a question, you might want to go ahead and get your presentation ready.
Are you seeing my images again?
Not yet, but if you could share your screen, Tony, we are getting a couple of questions in.
Okay. This is a conceptual slide or a conceptual representation. So I think that this concept was originally drawn based on what happened in New Orleans after the Katrina. And so we used that. Actually, we've borrowed this whole figure from McAllister. And we don't have specific lengths of time, but things, there's things like the water, wastewater. We developed the timeline for recovery based on discussions with the sewer and water people in San Diego. And that's what they thought it would take to recover. And then we used, we're not being precise with these estimates. You can't be precise, but there's certain sort of intuitive and answers and certain answers from experts for the various systems, and when you get the community-wide disruptions that are expected, any normal repair time is going to be extended by that factor. Highways, bridges, railroads, water, sewer, electricity, and the buildings all going down at once. And one of the things I didn't really emphasize there was that with all that loss of water and all the disruption to the pipelines, the fuel pipelines, you have the potential for a lot of fires, and you have no water pressure to fight the fires. So that further complicates the situation, increases the losses, and slows the recovery.
Tony, do you just have a sense of rough order of magnitude what the timeline is? We understand that the graph here is conceptual, but maybe for some of the major pieces that you're looking at, what a long lead time versus a improved lead time might be.
Yeah. Well, we've talked about several months. I mean, we derived from discussions with the various players, 2 to 3 months generally on the things like water, sewer, and that would get it sort of mostly functional, not fully fixed. They would extend it out even to years for the full fix. Sort of each one, getting all the pieces back together, comparing one way to estimate it is in comparison to Katrina. And we're thinking it's into the years to get everything back together. And that if you are able to improve it, it depends on the extent of the improvement. But certainly if you were able to make the water sewer systems resilient so that the coastal communities would not need to be evacuated, essentially, that would be a huge improvement, cutting that disruption from several months down to perhaps several days.
Okay. So we have a couple more questions coming in, Tony. The next question is from Glenn Moritzen, who asked, are any public ordinances or funding bills being proposed to meet the community resilience goals at this time?
I don't have all the specifics on that. There is a county resiliency officer who participated with us, who is very interested in pushing these things forward. I don't think he's been diverted by the COVID-19 in recent months, but two, I don't think that they've taken specific steps since our report was released. However, they do have some background programs that I talked about, the pure water system for one, general upgrading of the water and sewer systems. They have not focused in on the Rose Canyon fault problems, but we've called it to their attention many times, and hopefully that will begin to build into the long-term thinking. So I don't think that anything has been enacted since the report. The report came out early March, and COVID-19 broke out in early March, so it diverted attention. But these are all long-term things. One of my recommendations there was that the SEAOSD maintain communications with their political leaders, council people, et cetera, whomever, people like this Gary Johnson, the chief resiliency officer at the county, and maintain a long-term dialogue so that we can work with them to assist moving the ball forward, getting appropriate ordinances placed, and guiding the building-related and structural engineering-related policies in the right direction.
Well, that's a good segue, Tony. Michael Braun asked, since releasing the scenario, quote, just before the COVID disruption, had there been any discussions with the city or county about taking any next steps?
Lots of discussions. We hadn't reached The mayor, we've spoken with our councilman and the supervisor. It had not reached the point of obviously of getting commitments. We'd gotten interest, and I think we got a fair amount of news in early March. However, it did get a bit washed over by COVID. So it's got to be a long-term process. We have a book, a report that we can hand to them and demonstrate, the thinking of the technical community as to what the vulnerabilities are and what the need for resiliency policy is. And I think that we should embrace that as a long-term effort by SEAOSD and EERI to try and make things happen on a long-term basis.
Well, and Tony, maybe I'll close out with just one question before we hand things over to Peter, which is kind of on that subject of, first of all, are there any plans that you're aware of for yourself or with ERI to target call it second press kit type of outreach in, maybe middle of next year to try to catch a different news cycle? And the second portion of that question would be, if you could make a recommendation to practicing structural engineers in San Diego, what would be kind of your top line recommendation to advocate for this type of awareness in the community and with non-engineers? Yeah.
In terms of a second round with the press, we're thinking in nearer term. We're thinking late summer we haven't actually printed the document, but we want to do a second round of reaching back out to the stakeholders we've dealt with, present the document, and remind them of the issues and of our interest in assisting with advancing the resiliency policy. So that is in the works. It's something you need to keep after and push through for years to come. Jorge Menendez from EERI is pretty dedicated to the project, and I think will continue the promotion effort for some years. I will for some while, but Peter is brought in to carry the torch. He didn't know that, but I think that's a good idea. And I think SEAOSD should integrate it into their long-term planning as something to work towards. And remind me the second half of your question.
Well, the second half really was the engagement with our practicing structural engineers.
Yeah.
There was kind of a top line recommendation in terms of how we can assist with advocating and making sure that we're raising awareness.
Well, as I proposed, I think to you on an email in the last month, I think that we can add the discussion and the scenario document references to our website. We can make it part of EBC's mission to advance the inventory and the what I call drafting of retrofit ordinances, so that they're shovel ready. They're ready to present to the city council whenever they're interested, or certainly post the next earthquake. Legislative committee might be able to work with existing buildings in that direction. There are good examples in the other communities, LA and San Francisco, that you can draw upon to formulate a draft ordinance that's much better targeted than something the politicians might come up with on their own. Let's see, and I think that generally reaching to your clients. I deal with a lot in existing buildings, and you get these guys who will spend $50 to $100 million on rehabbing an old building, and they don't have to do seismic, so they don't do it. Well, if you wave the book at them, show them the potential and the downsides for this earthquake, that you can move their thinking a little bit towards doing a retrofit. So, I think it's a long-term, broad effort. We need to be aware of the document, and we need to remind the people, the clients and the public of the issues. We've, over the last 20 or 30 years, we've tried to say to people that there is a Rose Canyon threat, But I think having an updated scenario report that shows its likelihood and its potential consequences is useful, and the report should be used as a tool in moving us towards making the place more resilient than it is currently.
Yeah, absolutely.
I mean, you look at those downside risks on the utility, the infrastructure side, and it's just pretty devastating. And the same goes for older vulnerable buildings. So, we should get some resonance, and some people should respond to that. Gary Robbins at the City of San Diego is interested in this. I mean, at the San Diego Union Tribune is interested and writes a pretty good scientific article, so we can maintain communication with him as we develop things.
Absolutely. Well, thank you, Tony. That was a great presentation and introduction. Mike McNeff, I saw that you asked a question of how do you think building owners will receive this information? I'm just going to mention that because I think it's a good intro question actually for Peter, who's going to present on the existing building inventory that our existing building committee has been investing a lot of time on. And Mike, we'll make sure that we circle back around to your question before we close out the seminar for the day. With that, Peter, please take it away.
All right, can you hear me and see the presentation?
Yes, we can.
Awesome, thank you, Casey, and thanks, Tony, for passing the torch there. I'd echo Tony's sentiment that we should, I think one of the biggest steps we can make is to all read the report. There's a lot of work that went into that. So I definitely applaud Tony and the rest of the EERI committee that pulled that together. So what I'll focus on today a little bit is the vulnerable building inventory part of this whole scenario. So we'll cover a little bit about what these buildings are, where in San Diego they're really concentrated, and then how we're taking the first steps towards understanding what our existing building stock is down here in San Diego. So the big problem really boils down to the fact that modern seismic design at least, is still really a relatively young field. A majority of the early seismic building codes were really significantly based on actual earthquake observations. So after each major earthquake, damage is observed, and as a result, the building codes would be updated. Unfortunately, existing buildings that exhibited some of the vulnerable traits, but that did not collapse, were left in place, and they're typically not required to be retrofit. So these buildings then become hazards for future earthquakes. The problem is we don't really know to what extent that these buildings actually occur throughout our cities. So if we don't know the problem, how can we be expected to come up with a ssolution? And that's really where our building inventory comes in. So this effort was kicked off by Tony initially, I think it was nearly 5 years ago, and it really was put in place to inventory some of the older concrete structures to inform the work of this scenario. Over the years, the effort morphed several times, and then roughly 2 years ago, we picked this effort back up at the SEAOSD EBC and really redefined the scope. And so we envisioned that this new inventory would be a little bit more than just a count of vulnerable buildings, but really a full electronic database that could really help city policymakers and future engineers to inform our decisions. So the first step was defining what type of buildings were of interest. And for our purposes, we focused on 5 different vulnerable building types. In the engineering field, I think we would all agree that these buildings are typically more susceptible to major earthquake damage than other buildings. Won't spend too much time on them since we're all engineers. But the first being unreinforced masonry buildings. So back in the 1933 Long Beach earthquake, several of these structures collapsed, and a lot of them were schools. And so this earthquake actually led to a lot of public awareness about the dangers of these buildings since they were such high-profile structures. Eventually, California ended up banning new construction of these buildings, and that was back in the late 1930s. However, at the time, nothing was done to retrofit buildings that had already been built. So we're left with many hazardous buildings for future earthquakes. So down the road to the 1980s, several more earthquakes have demonstrated the vulnerabilities of these buildings. And the state of California actually passed legislation that required cities to inventory their URM stock and then to, quote, adopt a loss reduction program. So this actually became really our state's first retrofit or inventory ordinance. San Diego previously inventoried all of our URM buildings, and a partial retrofit program was put in place. This program addresses some of the major deficiencies with these buildings. However, partially retrofit buildings, they're really still hazards, as can be seen in some of the photos above here. Only a very small portion of the San Diego URM stock has actually taken that next step to be completely retrofit with some sort of supplemental lateral system. Next main category of buildings are non-ductile concrete buildings. These are typically concrete wall or frame structures built prior to 1980. In the early 1970s, the vulnerabilities of these buildings, it was really highlighted when several of pretty new concrete structures collapsed during the San Fernando earthquake. New detailing requirements were adopted by future codes, but again, structures that were built prior to those code adoptions were left in place. We have rigid wall flexible diaphragm buildings. These are concrete tilt-up or concrete block structures. You may have heard of them commonly referred to as tilt-up structures for the concrete ones. So prior to 1980, we had very, very poor roof-to-wall anchorage connections. You can see cross-grain bending connection shown up there on the top right. And these tend to separate, leading to separate the walls and roofs during earthquakes, which can lead to collapse of the roof and the wall panels. After the 1980s, or after 1980, the cross-grain bending was prohibited as the main connection, but it wasn't until the late 1990s that we really fully understood the force requirements that were in these connections. So we're really left with two bins of buildings here, one that are pre-1980 that exhibit this cross-grain bending, and then between 1980 and 97 where we just don't have quite strong enough connections. We have pre-Northridge steel moment frame buildings, and the Northridge earthquake really exposed the vulnerabilities of these buildings. After the earthquake, it was found that many of the buildings had fractures in those welds between the beams and the columns. And again, there were emergency code change proposals directly after the earthquake, but buildings built prior to that code change have not been addressed in most places. And our fifth type of building are wood soft story buildings. These are usually your multi-unit residential housing that are either over a garage or tuck under parking in the first story. There's obviously a lot of openings down low and very limited stiffness in that first story. And so all of the damage concentrates in that story, leading to potential collapse. Again, in the Northridge and Loma Prieta earthquakes, many of these structures collapsed and performed very poorly. So the goal of the inventory as a whole was to have a citywide electronic database of what vulnerable buildings we had. And we were able to harness several tools to be able to compile that database. So definitely one of the most important tools that we were able to use was the Sanborn Maps. If you have not seen these maps, they're fire insurance maps produced by the Sanborn Company. And in San Diego, they date back to about 1956. There were some changes in them, kind of pasted in up until about the 1960s, but nothing newer than that. So that 1956 date kind of presents us with an issue. It leaves us with, the years between then and 1980 or 1997, where we had significant development and redevelopment of the city, where we now have outdated information on the maps. So this could not be the sole source of our inventory. So these are broken down into about 7 volumes of maps in the city and roughly 440 pages. So here you can see a typical page of these maps, which covers a couple blocks of the city. And you can see that these old databases are actually really impressive. And most buildings are somewhat accurately color-coded by building type. A lot of them even have descriptions of the lateral and gravity systems. seeing these detailed Sanborn maps really serves as more justification and a little bit of inspiration that this building inventory is really crucial for our city. You know, we had this good of information back then, and we really don't have much now. So we should have a better database. The next tool that we really relied on was the San Diego Tax Assessors Database. When we first got this publicly accessible file, we found over 1 million rows of data, each of them for a different parcel number, and then 31 columns of somewhat complete data about each parcel. We were able to reduce this down to about 55,000 buildings countywide and 25,000 buildings for the city of San Diego by removing some of the residential housing units and using several other sorting techniques. By reducing this information to a mere 55 or 25,000 buildings, we were able to really turn this overwhelming database into something that was a little bit more usable for this building inventory. The big problem with this database is that it's meant for what you'd expect by the name, and that's for assessing taxes. So the data relevant to assessing taxes is pretty well kept. However, all of the other data points are pretty inaccurate, and you can't really rely on them directly. We found square footage is missing, or maybe they only captured one unit out of a multi-unit building. They have a building type category, which we were pretty excited about, which turned out to be pretty utterly useless, I would say. And then probably the most frustrating part of this database was that it was a pre-Y2K database, and thus we only have 2 digits for the year constructed. And this obviously leads to problems when you have a building that says 97 and you don't know if that's 1897 or 1997. So it's hard to filter with that database. One of the probably the coolest tools that we found during this effort, and definitely a useful tool, was historicareals.com. I'd be a proponent to definitely go take a look at this website. It's a free website and has access to satellite imagery for several different years, dating back to about 1953, or at least in San Diego, dating back to 1953. So using this imagery really allowed us to pinpoint certain areas of interest for the inventory. And then it was also really crucial to help us determine rough dates of construction for some of these buildings where we don't have good information in the database and where it's not showing up on the Sanborn maps. Rather than going on actual sidewalk surveys, we were actually able to complete this inventory using Street View surveys. And we were able to use Google Maps for both the satellite view and the street views. This really cut back on time, and it helped us keep good electronic records. Probably the biggest benefit of Google Maps, though, was the ability for us to create our own maps so that we could collect and record all of our data all in one resource. So we were able to import all of the critical tax assessors database once we had filtered that down into defined latitudes and longitudes, and then display them on Google Maps. We could then edit the data in the map, which allowed us to visually keep track of our progress within each different area that we broke down here. For vulnerable buildings, we could then add relevant information from the Sanborn maps, add information regarding square footage, number of stories that we were looking up, and then add any other observations that might help us keep track of why we had rated these buildings the way we had. This was all able to be exported into a spreadsheet database so that we could keep full records. So in my eyes, this development was really the breakthrough of our efforts that really made this process feasible. So that was a lot of setup, and to be honest, really a major part of this effort was just figuring out how to actually proceed effectively through this inventory and to keep records of this process. But now we can talk some results here. So our current survey, we've currently completed about, we've currently completed our inventory of downtown San Diego. That was composed of 2 different Sanborn volumes of the 7, over 5 square miles of area and over 2,500 buildings. Additionally, we're working on inventories for Pacific Beach area and the Sorrento Valley area. Today, I'll really only focus on the results from the downtown inventory. So here you can see on the right side, we have our map showing plotted points for buildings that fall within the vulnerable building categories that we previously mentioned. So red are the non-ductile concrete, yellow URM, brown are the rigid wall flexible diaphragm, blue is wood soft story, and then we have green for the steel moment frame buildings. You can see that the region bounded by I-5 and the Embarcadero area is really a large distribution of non-ductile concrete, URM, and steel moment frame structures. Whereas we really have wood soft story buildings shown in blue here, concentrated in the residential areas up north and east of downtown. And then the rigid wall flexible diaphragms typically occurring down in the southern part of this map here, where we have a little bit more industrial areas. So if we look at the left here, you can see a chart showing the building type as a count of the number of buildings, right? So this is just purely a count of how many there are. And the chart really seems to indicate that the downtown area is dominated by non-ductile concrete and URM buildings. The question that I'll propose, though, is does this really show us the full picture? And so here we can see we have the exact same plot and chart, except now that the size of points is now representative of the square footage of the building. So it's immediately apparent that the green steel moment frame and the red non-ductile concrete buildings jump out a lot more, whereas kind of the URM buildings fade into the background a little bit. And this is backed up by the breakdown on the left, where you'll see that now non-ductile concrete and steel moment frame buildings really account for over 80% of the square footage of the vulnerable buildings in this downtown inventory. So it's likely a much better indicator of the risk associated with the overall size of these and with the potential cost to retrofit these buildings. To further that point a little bit, we can look at the number of buildings for each vulnerable building category, then broken down into their occupancy types. So of note here, you can see in light blue, we have commercial buildings, dark blue, we have government buildings, and then orange buildings are hotels, and yellow is showing residential buildings. Again, this is showing the data by a number of buildings. And if we break this down into square footage, then we really get a better understanding of the distribution of overall space. So similar to the previous graphs or the previous images, you'll see that the steel moment frame buildings were again significantly underrepresented in that count graph. And you'll also note that this hotel and government buildings have substantially increased in these current graphs. This is because these occupancies really tend to be located in larger mid and high-rise structures. This really reinforces the point that having an understanding of the square footage of these buildings is really crucial to completely understand the building stock. And a rough count is not going to do it for us. So looking into some individual building types, here we have a map of the full city and showing the URM buildings in the city. So because we had the previous URM inventory from the 1990s, we were able to harness that data and then update it to remove demolished buildings or those that were categorized as not URM in that previous database. Our current inventory shows that we have roughly 480 buildings that remain on this URM list. In the downtown area, this accounts for roughly 260 buildings. And then the other 220 occur in clusters up north of Balboa Park, up in the Hillcrest and North Park areas, and then some more up in the downtown La Jolla area, where we have some older parts of the city. The graph on the left here is showing the distribution of these buildings by number of stories. You'll see that San Diego's URM stock is significantly 1 and 2 stories. However, we have a stock of roughly 80 buildings that are 3+ stories. Again, nearly all of these buildings have been partially retrofit. However, very few of these structures have been completely retrofit, so they do still pose some risk for our city. Here we've plotted all the non-ductile concrete buildings that we have in our downtown inventory. The table on the left here shows a plot of the number of stories along the top, and then the year constructed along the left, and then with the number of buildings in the cells that align there. Along the bottom, you can see the percentage by number of stories, and you can see that really 50% of this building stock is in 1 to 2 story buildings. One of the trends that you'll also note from this table is that as the years have progressed, the building heights have really expanded significantly. In our effort downtown for the inventory, we found a lot of concrete mid and high-rise hotels and condos that were built in the late 1960s up till the 1980. This trend we expect to expand outside of downtown, and we really expect to find a lot of these mid to high-rise hotels and condos throughout the city. Here you can see a plot of the steel moment frame buildings downtown. We found that classifying these buildings is very difficult as the building system is completely clad and obviously nothing's exposed. For that reason, we really focused our effort on just the taller structures where we have a little more confidence that these are moment frame buildings likely. You can see in this plot here that in the 1980s and 1990s, there was a big development of 20-plus story buildings in the downtown area. And really most of the square footages of these buildings can be lumped into those categories. You'll see that these buildings are really arranged in clusters around the city, and this includes the business districts between C Street and Broadway. And then there's a lot of hotels and condominiums down by the Embarcadero. So if anything, I hope that some of this data has shed some light on really the complexity of our existing building stock in San Diego. With the significant presence of vulnerable buildings, you might be wondering what can we actually do about it? And the good news here is that we're not on our own down here in San Diego. As of today, several cities have begun to lead this effort to address the risk in their existing building stock, and they're doing this through voluntary and mandatory retrofit ordinances. You can see here in Southern California, it's really Los Angeles, Santa Monica, and West Hollywood that have led this effort for citywide ordinances, and a lot of these are mandatory ordinances. This is being expanded up into the Northwest even, and Seattle and Portland are really diving into their URM buildings to better understand them. The important thing to realize is really that the first step of each of these ordinances is for the city to understand their exposure to this risk. So in other words, an inventory is really instrumental in kicking off this process. So outside of cities, we have hospitals, public schools, and obviously in the UC systems, which have inventoried their buildings, and they're now taking measures to prepare these structures. And then there are many large corporations which have also begun to implement seismic programs where they're inventorying and then addressing their buildings. Again, big point being here that all of these are spurred by building inventories. All right, so what's next for our study here? I'll give you an encouraging statistic, and that's that we have completed roughly 6 square miles of our inventory, which we're pretty excited about, and that sounds pretty good. And if I could ask, I would ask if anyone could guess the total area of the city of San Diego. And unfortunately, it's over 370 square miles. And so that means that we've completed roughly 1.6% of our city of San Diego inventory. So obviously that's a little bit misleading, as this inventory has been in the most dense portion of the city, and there's a lot of undeveloped land in the city of San Diego. So when we look at it from a number of buildings perspective, we have completed roughly 15 to 20% of the buildings in the database, which we feel pretty good about. Expanding this effort really will not be able to be completed solely on the backs of volunteers, so we're really hoping that we can engage the city of San Diego in future pursuits here in order to expand and kind of finalize this survey. While this project focused on the city of San Diego, we believe that we've really set up a solid framework to inventory, and we hope that we can expand this effort with the help of other local cities. We've also identified some additional areas and would like to investigate these hotspot areas to expand the survey. So one of the cooler parts of this project has been getting to see the history of the development of San Diego. So on the left here, you can see a plot of the buildings from the database, and these are mapped out on ArcGIS. And on the right here, we have satellite imagery of downtown San Diego. And so this is currently showing 1935 building stock, and then 1953 was the oldest satellite imagery. As we progress to 1960, you can see the development of I-5 up in the northern part of this satellite image. And then in the ArcGIS, you will see some major expansion out to the east in El Cajon. If we go to 1980, you'll notice that downtown really has several high-rise buildings now. You can see all the shadows in this image there. And then there's been major development up in the Kearny Mesa and Miramar areas. When we go to 1997, Sereno Valley and Rancho Bernardo have become significantly developed. And then here we have today, you'll notice that we have Petco Park in the bottom right corner and a lot of major development in the East Village area. So using some of these GIS maps, we can pull together maps showing just the buildings prior to a year. So we're looking here at buildings that were built prior to 1980, and we can really start to pinpoint certain building types in certain districts. And so we've identified here areas where we would expect to see rigid wall flexible diaphragm buildings, where we would expect to see steel moment frame buildings. And this can help us pick these hot spots that we want to look further into. Similarly, buildings between 1980 and 97, we can take some guesses on where we may find some clusters of this era steel moment frame and rigid wall flexible diaphragm buildings. Looking quickly into one of these areas, I'll give you just a sec to look at this photo and see if anyone can try to figure out where it is. There's no major freeways in it yet, and this is from back in 1953. But if you look at it, you can look very small on the left side here. You'll actually see Scripps Pier down here, and you'll see Miramar Air Base here on the right side. So this is the UCSD, Torrey Pines, Sereno Valley area. As we progress to 1966, you'll see I-5 freeway start coming through and some development around the UCSD campus. By 1980, we've really seen some significant development of the edges of the mesa, and then a lot of residential development up in the eastern part of the mesa here. Between 1980 and 94, the majority of Sereno Valley really is developed. And then here we have our current day city. So really with the current effort that we've put in, we've proven that we have a solid path forwards towards an inventory. We've really explored a lot of the powerful technologies that can help us effectively display and comprehend the large amounts of data that we gather through this inventory. So expanding this inventory to capture the rest of the city's buildings, I believe will really provide a powerful tool for engineers and policymakers. And I think it's a great next step to prepare the city for the future. So all that said, if you have any interest in helping with this pursuit, please reach out to me. My email contact's down here. We'll definitely keep you updated on the future of this pursuit, and hopefully you'll hear more about it in the upcoming months and years. And that's all I've got. So I will open it up to any questions.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. So just as a reminder, if you want to post a couple of questions, I'd be happy to share those with Peter and get a response. Peter, I promised Mike McNeff that we'd come back to his question that he'd posed for Tony's presentation, but I think your response would be good there too, which is, how do you think building owners will receive this information?
Yeah, and I think that's a great question. You know, I think in San Diego, like Tony kind of mentioned, there's this perception that earthquakes are not a problem here just because they have not been recorded in recent history and people have not been experiencing them. I would imagine that the results of the scenario are a little eye-opening and hopefully can be used as a kind of gateway into a conversation, so kind of showing that it's not you as the engineer. It's this whole community that believes this is an issue. But I can imagine there'll be some tricky conversations there. And Tony has, yeah.
That I've seen a significantly growing appreciation by the local community of these issues. Maybe it's a higher level of sophistication in part, where you get people who own properties here and elsewhere, and they are aware of the risks, and they want to control the risks. So they come and say, we've got a portfolio of buildings, we want to know what the risks are. We want to manage this, and the scenario is a useful tool in helping them gauge what their risk level is. And this inventory of buildings focuses on where the risk is in the older buildings. So I've also found from the city of San Diego a great deal of interest in upgrading the buildings in Balboa Park. So I've gotten much more positive response than negative response over the last several years of dealing with stakeholders and property owners.
Yeah, thank you for that context, Tony. Peter, a question just as we're waiting for any others to be typed in here for myself. Maybe you can speak to, there's a lot of data on the maps here, and they're very impressive maps. So thank you very much for the effort that EBC has put in. They obviously look like they can be pretty specific in terms of if somebody wanted to pick out their building. And I know there's some sensitivity around how the data is shared here, what's the purpose, where does it go? So maybe you can talk to what the kind of next steps are. You mentioned some of the retrofit ordinances that data like this might be used for, but if you could maybe talk for what the things like you could see the data being used for in best case scenario, and kind of how you're also trying to be sensitive to the data in terms of not throwing somebody under the bus.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's a great point, Casey. And really, the goal of this is obviously not to shame our building owners or our city that they have bad buildings. And we have been, like you mentioned, trying to be careful to make sure that this information is, it's kept, and we do need to keep address information and kind of location in order to make sure that we're properly, going through and understanding where these buildings are and making sure that they get counted once and only once. So that they do get a little specific. This database, we're not intending to be a public database by any means. And we're really hoping that it can be information provided to the city of San Diego to help them understand their risk exposure, and then go forward, proposing either a mandatory or voluntary retrofit ordinances for different building types that are seen as the most important and problematic in the city. I can also see this information being used for some sort of emergency planning. Obviously, knowing where your most vulnerable buildings are is important for kind of preparedness for after earthquake rescue or inventory and tagging. So really, we're hoping that this can expand into more than just a count of buildings and a map of buildings. We presented at EERI, and we also had some additional interest from people that are trying to deal with waste management after seismic events. So that was just kind of another one of these interesting points that got brought up.
Yeah, and I'll add to that. There are many things you can do with Peter's database, and I'm sure we'll find applications. All the ones he mentioned are good ones. Sort of a tangent, a parallel thought is that I didn't mention earlier. As we move towards developing retrofit ordinances, we need to be aware that the private owners need financial incentives to do the work. And you can look at a long-term scenario where they lose their building versus fix it, and that's an incentive. But many of the California jurisdictions and many of those stakeholders have either found ways, or on the case of the jurisdictions or on the homeowners, express the interest in getting some financial incentive. You can't just pass a mandatory ordinance and put the full financial burden on the property owners.
Yeah.
We have one more question that came in, and I'm going to read that off. We probably have time for maybe one or two more. So if you had a final question, please make sure you get it in before we wrap up here for the day. Mike McNeff actually had a follow-up question. It appears to me that all the inventory has done is identify, quote, non-modern or old buildings, and then automatically classify them as vulnerable. And the question is this legal?
Mike coming in with the hard-hitting questions here. No, I think it's a good point that really this is we've called it a vulnerable building inventory, and it's really to lump these into bins, right? These are buildings that would fall under what SEAOSD has said, in past correspondence, and the state has really defined as being potentially vulnerable buildings. But it's a great point that not all of these are going to be vulnerable. But obviously, in the first step here, we don't have time to go through and evaluate the lateral system of each of these buildings. So yes, that's how many cities have been doing this, is kind of coming up with these bucket lists. And if you fall into this bucket, you need to evaluate your building or provide documentation that you don't have the vulnerabilities that are common in these buildings.
Great.
Whether it's legal, yeah, I guess I can't say much there, other than, again, we're not trying to shame people here. And yes, this is a potentially vulnerable building list.
All right, and I think we'll have one more question from Jim Conley. Is the process available to be shared? ? I could see using this process to identify sustainably designed buildings in San Diego, LEED certification, or etc. So I think some of the more like database processes that you've developed here, Peter.
Yeah, definitely. And please reach out to me for anything. We're excited at some of the tools that we were able to find throughout this whole process, and definitely are willing to share it and work with anyone to further any of their projects also.
That's great. With that, we are going to go ahead and wrap up. I want to just extend another thank you wholeheartedly to Tony and Peter. You guys have given just a really insightful and thoughtful presentation for our group. Let's do one more round of applause. If everybody could unmute yourself, and we'll go ahead and give these guys a clap. So on the count of 3, as you guys are reaching over to unmute. Thank you, guys. And I also want to thank each of you guys who signed in today. We had a fantastic turnout of over 70 attendees for this presentation, and I'm so excited to see our San Diego community just continuing to come out. So much appreciated. We will be in touch and look forward to hopefully seeing you guys virtually again in the near future. All right. Goodbye and have a great day.
All right.
Thanks, Casey.
Thank you.
All right. Thanks, guys.